92nd Street Y online media is made possible by the generous support of the Sidney E. Frank Foundation and by listeners like you. This program features Nora Efron, Elizabeth Janeway, Carolyn Kaiser, and Helen Vendler discussing Women Writers, Has Anything Changed? It was recorded December 11th, 1972, before a live audience at New York's 92nd Street Y.
We're here tonight to discuss Women Writers, Has Anything Changed? I'm Helen Vendler to moderate the discussion. To my left is Elizabeth Janeway, the novelist. To my right, Carolyn Kaiser, the poet. And further to my right, Nora Efron, freelance journalist and writer. First, Nora Efron will speak. Second, Carolyn Kaiser. Lastly, Elizabeth Janeway. They will each give about a 7-minute presentation of some aspect of the question we're discussing tonight. After that, we'll discuss things among ourselves for a while, and then we will open up the topic to questions and discussion from the audience. Nora Efron.
This morning in the New York Times, there was a little squib describing this evening in which it said that one of the questions we were going to take up was whether more books by women are being reviewed. It occurred to me that we hadn't thought of that question. But I did a little bit of work on it. In the last couple of weeks, I've talked to quite a few editors and agents just about what their general impression was in terms of were there more women writing. This is always an impression because unfortunately there's no statistic on this. I called Bowker hoping that they had done it. And the man I spoke to seemed to be surprised that I would even want such a statistic. It was a very weird reaction, really. But in any event, everyone is under the impression that more women are writing books than used to write books, and that more nonfiction books are being written by women on subjects that perhaps weren't given to them. The Times Book Review, I do know a little bit about. I've done some statistics on it, and they're really sloppy statistics. But in 1971 through 72, of 50 book reviews that I went through, there were 697 major reviews. And of that, 101 of those reviewed books by women. So that's 14.5%. Now, this afternoon I picked 1956 because it was a volume that was available and didn't have a lot of dust on it. And it was supposedly a period of female, oppression, the height of the feminine mystique and so on. And I went through 26 issues of it, and of 725 books that were reviewed, 107 were by women, which is 14.4%. So has anything changed? 0.1%? I don't know. In any event, I can't tell you how bad those statistics are, because I went through those books, and you get to people who are named Jocelyn and either Evelyn or Evelyn, and you have no idea whether to tabulate them as men or women. But anyway, so much for that question. I wanted to talk a little bit about the way critics react to books by and about women, because I've noticed lately some things that have been interesting and irritating. In the Autumn American Scholar, there's a panel discussion among 8 prominent women writers. Elizabeth Janeway is one of them. And Norma Rosen says something in it which I think is interesting, which I'd like to quote. She says, "In the fall of 1969, a scant 3 years ago, a review of a novel of mine appeared in the New York Times. Here's a quote from the review, quote, One cannot read this novel without stumbling over queries about the female condition. If only this topic might stay in the garage for a while. It just isn't one of our primary national problems. These words, said Miss Rosen, astonish us today. And now if I reveal that the reviewer was a woman, how much more astonishing. Progress has been made. No reviewer, male or female, would make such a comment today. There's one other quote from that I'd like to read because I think it also really ties in, and it's from Anne Burstein, who says, "With my last book, I have felt a new kind of respect, and I know that I owe this to the whole women's liberation thing because suddenly my subject has become a respectable subject. Such things as adultery, children underfoot when you're trying to make love, kids, ice boxes, you know, trying to neck in front of an open refrigerator door and the kids crawling underneath. You see, that's actually a real, if comic, sexual activity that used to be considered silly, unimportant, but is now, by reviewers anyhow, considered rather legitimate." Well, I think all of that is true. I think that books that were once dismissed as women's novels, you know, or as soap opera, it's interesting that no man, however trashy a book he writes, is ever accused of writing soap opera. But, you know, that those women's novels, so-called women's novels, were really condescended to 3, 10, 15 years ago, obviously. I think what we've moved to now, though, is a new condescension. It's not as obvious as the old condescension. I think that when Norma Rosen says no male or female would make such a comment today, I don't know that some of them wouldn't be thinking that. I'm not sure some people don't think, oh God, yet another book about that, but they know they can't say it. We have the condescension now is a better condescension, but it's still condescending. You know, and this doesn't exactly time, but backstage, Carolyn Kaiser was saying that in last month's commentary, Irving Howe has an article bemoaning the fact that there are no Jewish poets. And as Carolyn points out, that totally overlooks Maxine Kumin, Denise Levertov, Anne Sexton, Adrienne Rich, and Erica Jong. So anyway, I do think that certain kinds of books are treated respectfully now, and particularly if they have a kind of current smell to them. If they seem to be about women's liberation or you know, women's changing view of herself, bouncing off women's liberation, they're treated very, very respectfully. And what's also interesting is that if the books are well, I don't mean to put them down by saying if they smell current, but they're often branded with being women's liberation books, whether or not they are. I'm thinking of Play It As It Lays, which I don't know how many times I've read the word feminist in connection with, and I don't understand it at all. Cynthia Buchanan's novel Maiden, which had that thrown all over it, and it just wasn't about that, which is not to say they weren't marvelous books, obviously. The Bell Jar is another one. We have taken a vow on this panel to try and keep away from the Bell Jar because we could blow the whole evening on it. But one of the sad things also is that books that aren't like this, it seems to me, tend to be overlooked. You know, the kind of beautifully crafted, I hate to say woman's novel, but a beautifully crafted novel about women that is not about young women tends to be overlooked. I read a couple of books last year in a short period of time. One was Penelope Mortimer's novel, The Home, and another was a book by Violet Weingarten called A Woman of Feeling, and they were beautifully written books, and their publishers didn't play them up either. I don't mean to say this is the fault of the critics. if you don't fit that definition, that modern definition, you're likely to be overlooked. And if you do, you're likely to be overpraised. I think that there have been several books in the last year that, because they were so right on politically, were overpraised by women who are at this moment going through something of a crisis in does sisterhood preclude knocking a novel by a woman? And I think that some of them were also overpraised by men who are intimidated by the subject matter. But even with all this praise, there is so much condescension, and the most flagrant example of this is Anatole Broyard. Who is so condescending, especially when he's trying to be understanding and nice. It's really with friends like that who needs enemies. I have a feeling that if one could separate out Anatole Broyard from the rest of the critics, the whole picture might look a little different. But he's such a good example of this kind of condescending attitude of the critic who treats books by women as some kind of a subgenre of literature, not quite relevant, interesting really, how they do go on, and we really must try to understand them. Sort of books that are sort of over here and don't have anything to do with the mainstream of life, much less with literature. I always get uneasy at all the comparisons between women and blacks, but I do think that women are going through the same kind of thing that the black writers went through in the last 10 years. One review last April, which I found particularly irritating, was Broyard's review of Shelley Steinman List's book, which was called Did You Love Daddy When I Was Born? He also he talked about 3 other books in it, Lois Gould's Such Good Friends, Joan Didion's Play It As It Lays, and Sandra Hochman's Walking Papers. And the review began, I looked into 4 new novels by women writers and found that they are all about divorce. He went on at some length grappling with this question, and it infuriated me. I'm not sure logically why I got so angry at it, but one reason I think is that it seems rather obvious to me why a lot of women sit down to write novels after a divorce, and I don't think he quite got on to why. But also because I read so many novels by men that are about marriage and infidelity and divorce, and yet they're never called that. To think of just a kind of example, I mean, Herzog obviously had infidelity, and its Stern is about marriage and infidelity. And those were books that were supposedly about the Jew in America or man's dilemma or some such. Last summer I read Tom McHale's book, Principato, which got marvelous reviews. And that, of course, is about a disastrous marriage, and it's treated as finally a young Catholic writer. I don't mean that that's a terrific thing to be described at either, but,
right.
I also don't mean to say that these books aren't about divorce, but I think that describing them that way, as only that, is unfair. I read recently that Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was not a fan of Jane Austen's, put her down once by saying that all she wrote about was marriageableness, and it's very similar. Another review of Broyard's, I hate to carp on him, but he's such a good example of this. He did a review of Lois Gould's Necessary Objects, which he began by taking from Joan Didion what he then gave to Lois Gould. And the implicit assumption here was that there's only room for so many of this kind of writer. We're just going to let so many women writers up here or black writers up here. And I think my guess is that the World War II writers, Mailer and Jones and that whole crowd went through a lot of that on their second and third novels too. I don't mean that only women get treated that way, but it is implying that there's just this little subcategory that aren't quite in the mainstream. It isn't only the critics' fault that these books get put there. I don't want to say that. I was kind of interested recently in, there's been quite a movement of interest toward Virginia Woolf among people I know in the women's movement, and it's almost as if, having found her place, in literature, she's being pushed over somewhere else. She's being treated only as the author of A Room of One's Own. A friend of mine said to me the other day that she was very upset that the Times Book Review had let a man review the biography of Virginia Woolf, and I don't understand that. I don't think that only a woman can review that. So, it's sort of confusing as to what is wanted, and I don't know the answer to that. That's it from me.
Now, I'm told not to touch this mic because it's going to pick up my voice. Can you all hear me? No? Oh. Better? Can you hear me now? Right, good. All right, women's writing, has anything changed? That's the ostensible title of our discussion tonight. And I think the best way to illustrate what has changed or what has not changed is by giving you a couple of representative samples of women's poetry in the 20s, what used to be loosely referred to as the Oh God, the Pain girls. And I'm going to begin with Sarah Teasdale. I will forbear to quote from the poem that, alas, we all know, that begins, "When I am dead and over me bright April will shake out her rain-drenched hair," and then "You'll be sorry when I'm dead, you rascal, you," which, as a friend of mine said, reminded him of nothing so much as a sheepdog caught in a lawn sprinkler. But we'll try to read one of her better and more popular efforts here, maybe one or two. This one is called I Am Not Yours. I am not yours, nor lost in you, not lost, although I long to be. Lost as a candle lit at noon, lost as a snowflake in the sea. You love me, and I find you still a spirit beautiful and bright. Yet I am I who long to be lost as a light is lost in light. Oh, plunge me deep in love, put out my senses, leave me deaf and blind, swept by the tempest of your love, a taper in the rushing wind, or wind, if you prefer. Okay? Right, okay. All right. One more. What do I care? What do I care in the dreams and the languor of spring that my songs do not show me at all? For they are a fragrance, and I'm a flint in a fire. I am an answer, they are only a call. But what do I care? For love will be over so soon. Let my heart have its say, and my mind stand idly by. I'm sorry. For my mind is proud and strong enough to be silent. It is my heart that makes my songs, not I. Miss Teasdale was born in 1884. And let's turn to someone who is much more respectable intellectually. That is Eleanor Wiley. I'll try one of her better numbers. Now let no charitable hope confuse my mind with images. of eagle and of antelope. I am in nature none of these. I was, being human, born alone. I am, being woman, hard beset. I live by squeezing from a stone the little nourishment I get. In masks outrageous and austere, the years go by in single file, but none has merited my fear, and none has quite escaped my smile. All right? I mean, there in the middle stanza, we were really getting into it, weren't we, there for a moment? And then we cop out because we're only a lady poet, right? And then we come to someone born 10 years later, Louise Bogan, who wrote a poem of 2 lines, "In midnight, tears run into my ears," which is widely attributed to Dorothy Parker, right? And it sounds like the same old number, the self-pity and so forth. All right, so, one's had enough of that, hasn't one? And you want to know why there was so little pride, why there was so little anger, why there was so little expression of the angry and the ugly and the fierce and the sordid side of life and passion and dirt and muck and all that's part of being a living human being. So we turn for relief, we turn to a masculine voice. The poem, several voices out of a cloud. Let's take that. That's a fine, masculine, strong, urgent voice. Virile, you might say. Come, drunks and drug takers, come, perverts unnerved. Receive the laurel given, though late, on merit, to whom and wherever deserved. Parochial punks, trimmers, nice people, joiners, true blue, get the hell out of the way of the laurel. It is deathless, and it isn't for you. Okay, who wrote that? Louise Bogan, right. And she also wrote this. I had come to the house in a cave of trees, facing a sheer sky. Everything moved. A bell hung ready to strike. Sun and reflection wheeled by. When the bare eyes were before me and the hissing hair held up at a window, seen through a door, the stiff, bald eyes, the serpents on the forehead, formed in the air. This is a dead scene forever now. Nothing will ever stir. The end will never brighten it more than this, nor the rain blur. The water will always fall and will not fall, and the tipped bell make no sound. The grass will be always growing for hay, deep on the ground. And I shall stand here like a shadow under the great, balanced day, my eyes on the yellow dust that was lifting in the wind and does not drift away. Now she called that poem Medusa. And she calls this poem Cassandra. Because she dare not call him I, Louise Bogan. To me, one silly task is like another. I bear the shambling tricks of lust and pride. This flesh will never give a child its mother. Song like a wing tears through my breast, my side, and madness chooses out my voice again. Again. I am the chosen, no hand saves. The shrieking heaven lifted over men, not a dumb earth whereon they set their graves. All right, so there we have Bogan, who wrote like the ladies I read first, and who writes like the ladies who write today, except now we don't have to call ourselves Cassandra and Medea. We say, I feel like this, I feel rage, I feel hate, I'm not going to have children, I'm not going to be dominated by anybody except myself and my own needs. Right? Okay. Now let me take 2 minutes to read 1 or 2 poems by young women. I'm going to skip over my now the last middle-aged generation. Somehow we were always becoming, and then all of a sudden we've been, and there never seems to have been a time when we were, you know? All right, well, such is life. This is a poem by Erica Young called Men, after a poem called Women by Nicanor Parra. The impossible man, the man with the ebony penis 10 feet tall, the man of Pentelicon marble, the man with the veined bronze fig leaf which comes unhinged, the man who's afraid to get pregnant, the man who screws in his socks, the man who screws in his glasses, the man who screws in his sunglasses, the man who gets married a virgin, the man who marries a virgin, the man who wilts out of guilt, the man who adores his mother, the man who makes it with fruit, the husband who never has time, the husband who'd rather have power, the poet who'd rather have boys, the conductor who loves his baton, the analyst who writes the poems, and all those Adonises, all those respectable gents, those descended and those undescended, will drive me out of my mind sooner or later. Judith Johnson Sherwin, La Dolce Vita in Brussels. Paper profits. I've got a desk, a typewriter, a dog, 2 cats, one with a broken leg, 2 children I talk to more often when they're homesick, half a man, a house and words to fill it. You've got half a woman here, half another in the office, a desk, a company car, a ticket to the Lac de Garde. You don't want anything. You don't need me. You need an accounting. And Naomi Lazard. The waters of the moon. One would be a scholar, and one a good-for-nothing like her father. One would be gifted with lemon hair and cleverness, and they must relax about the other, not expect too much. The one would be enough for them, the one like a yellow lily. Snow will turn into doves for her and bend their necks. Meanwhile, there was time for us to sit and listen to the hours as they piped the green months. Time to feel the spring reaching us, and beyond us blowing dandelions. We played a game under the dining room table in the room behind the candy store. We were deep in our waterfall, where the silver fish jumped and surfaced, plunged to feed on the anemones. The skirt of the rock facing our face, brocaded with violets, hid us from sight. We knew the living stream. We built a city on the edge of that waterfall. We were 2 queens. We had a secret niche above a secret barrel. We kept our crowns there. when the afternoon blew like dust outside, when the sleeping windows closed, one queen walked her china doll, step by golden step, to the executioner. The dark queen commands, the gilded one must lose her head again. Sister, like a water lily, how clever life is at last. On this winter night, the 4 uncurtained windows shine across the miles between us. 4 empty windows and a tripod lamp inside. A shadow moves behind the glass. The woman is at home. It is twilight where you are, appearing, telling a rosary of dreams. The sky falls in upon the tallest buildings without a sound. Soon looms of darkness spin along the darkened ground. Getting older makes no difference. There is another daughter now, your flickering girl of 7. She has no sister, no china doll. She has the name we dreamed about as children, as if she had just jumped out of our waterfall, like one of those silver fish. And finally, a poem by the youngest of the lot, I think, Carolyn Kaiser. To the reader. Pacing from room to room, trimming the plants, I walk heavily on my heels. I smoke foul-smelling French cigarettes, invoke the portly blue stocking in gardening pants. Won't do. And if Catullus learns to cook while Lesbia goes to the bars to cruise, you haven't put up anything to lose, except 2 hours to read a different book. Boys will be boys and wonder in their rooms if fame could be a sociable disease. I'll sleep alone and murder whom I please and find another lover when the moon's in Scorpio. Be grateful to our mom. She let you off with cancer and the bomb. And on that ambiguous note, I will stop.
Our question lacks, I guess, a beginning point. Has anything changed since when? Has anything changed? I think we lack a point a quo, a terminus a quo. Where do we, has anything changed since when? Yes, I'm a novelist. I guess I'm also a historian by temperament. And I think if we are going to consider the problem as seriously as I believe we all want to, we must consider a bit our scope, our range. If we're saying, has anything changed in literature? Carolyn went back to the 20s. Nora, you didn't go back that far. If often it seems to be, has anything changed since there began to be a woman's movement? Well, hard to say. I doubt it. At any rate, I have a beautiful example on a Christmas card that came in this morning. A letter written by a friend catching us up with him and his wife. He's a professor who also writes books. I won't say his name, though you'd know it if I did. I will say he doesn't live in New York, so I don't think he's here. His first sentence is, we've been working away on my new book.
That's so true.
I must say I sympathize with Nora on the Times. 15 years ago, I exited from attempting to write for the Times magazine, stepping firmly on Lester Markel's toe as I did so. And it now appears that I cannot write for the New York Times magazine now. So there you are. I put in a good deal of effort attempting to interpret the sexual revolution as seen by women, and was told that I was muddled, which is a thing that has seldom happened to me, and I'm probably arrogant about this, but we can't go on talking about nothing but the Times. I do think, however, that they are kind of a prize example in what Nora's been saying and what my experience has been of the fact that what women in literature, I believe, are contributing to literature is a new way of structuring concepts. And any new way of structuring concepts is very difficult for members of the establishment to deal with, and the New York Times is preeminently that, or at least thinks it is preeminently that. There's nothing sexist in my discourse at the moment, because my husband tells me that the financial side of the Times finds it totally unable to comprehend what he is trying to say, although he is syndicated in about 100 other newspapers. So I'm not being simply a female about this. There is considerable difficulty in thinking and changing your mind around to pattern data in another way. This, it seems to me, is perhaps the most useful, valuable contribution that the women's movement is making, not only to literature, but to our whole overview of where we are in the world today. A lot of the difficulty, of course, is due to the feeling among men and among women who haven't thought about it very much that the whole women's movement is a fad and it will go away if nobody pays any attention to it. And you see, this is in fact backed up by the traditional image of woman, because she is conceived of being fickle, changeable, incapable of concentration. And if you just, don't answer her questions, she will go away and take up her needlepoint. This is wrong. I mean, it's a mistake. It's an error. However, if we change our time scale and try to talk about, has anything changed over the last 2 centuries? Yes, indeed it has. Carolyn was saying that it has changed over the last 50 years. I happen to be fonder of Eleanor Wiley than she is, and I could give you better poems of Eleanor Wiley. This is all right. This is perhaps merely a quirk. However, if we look back over 2 centuries, on that time scale, we can see where we're going, and I think we have moved, will continue to move, and the whole enterprise of women writing, which began really seriously as a thing that women could do less than 2 centuries ago, has now become accepted, normal, and not really freakish. Yes, it's true, as Nora says, the genre of the woman's novel is still pushed off into an enclave, but even so, we don't have to go through what the Brontes did and call ourselves by male names. We may still call ourselves Medea from time to time, but we don't have to be Cora Bell. An important thing that has happened to women during these 200 years in which they have been writing, to women writers, is that they have had a chance to evaluate their own experiences, to stand off from them, that is, and look at them reflectively, instead of simply knowing that they're happening to them on their nerve ends. This whole material of life, this experience of life, has become, for women writers, and through them for women readers, because that's all we are, we're instruments, has become material for reflection and intellection, and consequently for putting together into a structure of concepts, which I don't want to say it is our own, it isn't. I hesitate to say it's different, and yet it is. It's really very tricky. For instance, male writers have interpreted and expressed women's experience in the past and have done it magnificently. Who could not value and praise and rejoice in Chaucer and Shakespeare and Chekhov writing about women. If women are doing anything, it's adding perhaps a little to this material, because here we are, it happens to us, and things that do get overlooked, we don't overlook, we bring them up. But with some effort, men who care about women or care about writing simply because they want to write about the whole human race and not simply confine their remarks to half of it, men who care therefore about the race and about writing, I mean the human race, and who therefore respect women and are sensitive to their situation, they can indeed write very well about women. And equally possible for women to write about men's experience. In other words, you don't have to be Jewish to like Levy's bread. I think that may be just a little bit easier for women to write about men. I say that with a strong documentation and source to cite Robert Merton, who did a magnificent piece on insiders and outsiders, which I had the pleasure of reading in a recent American Journal of Sociology, points out that in slavery times, the house niggers knew an awful lot about what their white masters were doing. And the white masters didn't have a clue about the social patterns of slave life. The subordinate group has to know what the powerful are up to. Women have always had this advantage. Like black servants, like black slaves, women have had to be aware and sensitive to what was going on in that upper world. So I'm not talking about the actual material of experience. I think this is open to either sex, as I believe that it's open to any race to understand another race if they're motivated enough, if they want to, if there is cause. And I believe that the best writers are always those who are motivated and find cause to know and to understand as much about everybody else in the world as they possibly can. But women's experience of coming into man's world from the outside can, I believe, help them to see the structure of concepts that our society has lived by rather more clearly, perhaps, than the men who made it in the first place. We don't take quite as much for granted. We question more. We may want to factor in matters that have been overlooked. Well, what I'm saying is that as time passes and women, along with the other subordinate groups, move up and insist that our questions be listened to, as this happens, change will not only continue, it will grow in a healthy way because literature will widen its range and be able to write about more people, more experience, more reality. The 19th century in the novel was an enormous breakthrough because it became possible then to write seriously about people who had only been comic figures before. The lower classes began first then to be written about as actual serious human beings, not simply as the porters who knocked on the door in Macbeth. Well, do I have more time or have I run over?
I think we're running for 10 minutes.
We're all right. I have things I'd like to come to later, a little bit about books being written now, and a little bit about a great insight of Ellen Moore's into 19th century women writers, which I think is valuable for our time.
Could we have the house lights on now so that we could see the audience while the discussion goes on among the participants? All right. All right, the floor is open for these three discussants. Yes.
It's awfully nice to see you. It's terrible to all that blackness down there. It's much cheerier.
Nora, can I perhaps ask you to begin if there's anything that's been said that you'd like to comment on to begin the discussion?
No, there was nothing. I would like to hear a little bit more of what Elizabeth wanted to say.
Right.
Right.
Almost.
Thank you very much. Just very briefly, I want to make 2 points about books being written now. I think basically perhaps they can be divided into ones that are sort of emotive expressions, blow-offs, if you want to call it, which can now finally be made instead of being repressed. And there's never any dividing line down the middle, but from the other sort of book being written about women's situation now, it seems to me, are more explorations and hypotheses, attempts to understand where we are rather than just to let off steam. Now, that doesn't mean that I want to put down letting off steam. It's terribly important to you will never get rid of emotions, or you will never be able to use them to power a valuable, active connection with the world as long as they're just bugging you inside. You've got to be able to express them. But I think the combination of the two things, of perhaps harnessing emotions, working them through, and then applying them to building new structures of ideas is what we might hope for. Because I think in this way, we can get a working back and forth between literature and the world. Literature is monstrously important to me. It isn't, something I just, do when I sit down and read when I'm feeling tired, and that's obviously true for everybody up here, and many, many more, and many in the audience, I'm sure. But from time to time, we tend to talk of it as something apart from life, and I believe there's a constant interaction between the two, and that the literature being produced by women now is most important in its way of interacting with the world of reality, so that it, in any number of ways. I won't try to get into that. I'll just add that of the books being written now, I much prefer the angry ones to the self-pity ones, or the the pain, if you want, Carolyn. There's still an awful lot of ground, and I'm afraid I put Joan Didion right in with the que je souffre syndrome.
Right.
And I really would like to stop that nonsense.
Exactly.
Now, that doesn't mean that novels, of course, are about people, and fiction has got properly to put trapped, to show women who are trapped, but I hope that they won't be taken as being models. Well, to come back for a minute to the 19th century that we all came out of, to what we stand on, the giants on whose shoulders we sit. It's very interesting that today, one of the things that plagues Anatole Broyard more than almost anybody else I can think of is that women seem to be supporting each other. And those reviews that may have been a little bit more generous than they should have been, well, I don't think that's a good idea. I couldn't agree more. On the other hand, it can be taken, women can be taken as supporting each other when they shouldn't be, when really we may simply be joining hands in a kind of companionship which helps us toward an identity which is not just an individual and isolated identity, but an identity as a member of somebody reaching out to other people. And I found in an article by Ellen Moores in the Columbia Review of, I think it's the fall issue, I think it's quarterly, a marvelous little bit about how women in the 19th century, women writers, did depend on this and take strength and nourishment from it. And if I may, I would like to close just by reading you a little bit from this very revealing and she says it wasn't exactly loyalty because they didn't mind taking whomps at people who wrote bad books, and sometimes they took whomps at people who didn't write such bad books. But it wasn't just loyalty, but confidence was the resource that women writers drew from the possession of their own tradition, a confidence that could come from no other source. Male writers could study their craft in university or coffee house, group themselves into movements or coteries, search out predecessors for guidance or patronage, collaborate or fight with their contemporaries. But women through most of the 19th century were barred from the universities, isolated in their own homes, chaperoned in travel, painfully restricted in friendship. The normal literary life was closed to them. Without it, they studied with a special closeness the works written by their own sex and relied on a sense of easy, almost rude familiarity with the women who wrote them. When fame at last propelled Charlotte Bronte to London and gave her the opportunity to meet her greatest male contemporaries, she exhibited an awkwardness and timidity in literary society that have become legendary, except in one encounter, that with Harriet Martineau, to whom she sent a brusquely confident note soliciting a meeting. "I could not help feeling a strong wish to see you," she wrote. "Have the goodness to tell me when to come. It would grieve me to lose this chance of seeing one whose works have so often made her the subject of my thoughts." So, what was supplied for the nourishment of male literary production by simple acquaintance was replaced for women writers by the reading of each other's work, reading for intimate reverberation, for what Gertrude Stein called a sounding board. We have made a great deal of progress since the days when for women to write at all was ridiculous, if not impossible, but I think we can still profit from the reverberations between us.
Well, I'd like to answer something that Elizabeth raised, and then I'd like to ask Nora a question. First of all, in my rush to try to get through in the allotted time, I neglected to mention that of the earlier women poets that I read from, I picked pieces all except for Come Drunks and Drug Takers, which as far as I know has never been anthologized by anybody. I picked works by Teasdale, Wiley, and Vaughan from anthologies, and we all know who edits anthologies, don't we? Up until 15 minutes ago, they were all edited by men. And if Come Drunks and Drug Takers, Come Perverts Unnerved has been anthologized, it's by William Cole, but it certainly hasn't been anthologized by anybody else because it's not a ladylike poem. And it doesn't suit the image of the woman poet. And I'm sorry I failed to make that point. I know that Wiley's written better poems. As a matter of fact, as I tried to point out, the poem I read is a good poem, except at the end she loses confidence in herself. And I find as a teacher of young women that this happens over and over again, that they're able to make a brave and true statement about themselves and then end it with a kind of qualification, a kind of self-doubt, a kind of hesitancy. And the other, now that I'm on the subject of teaching women, let me say that the other major fault I find among women writers, and I guess it's because I discovered it in myself first, is a tendency that we have, which we share with certain fundamentalist preachers, although for different reasons, which is to say everything 3 times. And this is because nobody listens to us. And in poetry, this is fatal. You say it and you walk away from it. And if they didn't hear it the first time, baby, that's too bad. So this is one of the things we're learning. All right, enough of that. I want to ask Nora something. In her researches in the reviews of women writers, haven't you been struck, Nora, about how often the reviews of women or the critical accounts of women contain physical descriptions of them? And you start trying to imagine a review of a novel by Nabokov or Saul Bellow that goes on about how much hair they've got in their chest or how much they weigh or how sexy they are or how big their organ is. I mean, bosomy breasted Miss Kaiser. I was recently compared in a review to Mae West and Diamond Lil. You know, much as I admire Miss West as a prose stylist, I really don't think that we have very much in common. And Diamond Lil, as far as I know, for those of you who are not old enough, which includes practically everybody, let me say that she's, as I recall, she is a character in a film portrayed by Marlene Dietrich, where in the movie version, which was based on a book called Mother Goddamn, which of course had to be cleaned up for the movies and called Lady from Shanghai or Shanghai Lil or something like that. She is not the proprietress of the whorehouse, but she's a dancer. You know, whores are always dancers, you know, in those old-time movies, right? And, you know, Gary Cooper makes her go straight and be an honest woman because of love and stuff like that. Well, I don't feel that really has a hell of a lot to do with me and what I'm writing about either. And I don't find that when I read reviews of books by men that Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, Robert Coover et al. Are compared to Gary Cooper and Al Cap, or you know, little Abner. Somehow, this just doesn't seem to come up.
Now, you know, of course, it doesn't only happen to women writers, because about a month and a half ago, I was reading an article in the Times about Golda Meir standing up in the Israeli parliament to attack the West German security force, or the Israeli security force. I can't even remember, because the thing that struck me was that it said she was wearing a blue dress. And, you know, I mean, I just cannot think of a time that a head of state, you know, that we have been told what he was wearing if he was just wearing normal clothes. But, you know, another thing that happens beyond that is that I think that I've tried to notice this, and I don't have as much documentation as I should, but I notice that critics tend to put, well, gossip into reviews by women writers. I notice that Elizabeth Jane Howard's books are almost always, we always find out that her husband is Kingsley Amis in the review, but I look in Kingsley Amis's books being reviewed and I don't see the same thing. I don't mean that that's really even the level that I mean, because, oh God, I hate to do this again, but
Do it.
But in the review of Necessary Objects that Anatole Breillat did was gossip that, I mean, it was totally irrelevant, and it was nothing whatsoever compared to a review by Alden Whitman of the same book in the Los Angeles Times, which I cannot convey my shock to you about. I mean, it is an unpublishable review. It is just gossip from beginning to end. The fact that it isn't accurate gossip doesn't make it any, you know, I'm going to get this sentence confused and I'll never get it outright, but the ending is reprehensible. But I can't remember which way it works. But, you know, I just don't see this. There are so many well-known male writers, and in this tiny little world that we all live in, we often know who the mistress is in the novel, but it never seems to come up in the reviews, and yet when it's by a woman, it kind of goes down a little, and everyone feels free to share in all of this scuttlebutt.
Nora, don't you think that's a typical example of the sort of old image of the myth, if you want, of the woman's part of the world as being inner space? The home, you know, her place is there, and so when you start to talk about her, this whole business of the flickering flames of the fireplace and who she may be laying in front of it all pop up together. And it's just, again, it's part of the structure of concepts that women are emotive, expressive, they belong at home. And honestly, when this last book of mine was published in England, it got pretty good reviews most places, but the sort of communist newspaper in London said, "What do you mean she's taking seriously this idea that woman's place is in the home?" Well, of course, I wasn't taking it seriously. I mean, I took the tag "woman's place is in the home" as an example of social myth to examine. But even so, this reviewer felt that nobody could conceivably think that woman's place was in the home anymore. Let me tell you that not only in reviews, but out there in the great big industrial world of business and so on, why do you think there aren't any daycare centers for hard-pressed young women who have to make a living, who may be heads of households or may have husbands who can't bring home enough anyway, or one thing or another? There are 32 million women in the workforce in America right now, and the number of daycare centers that they have a chance to send their children to is minimal. Child care centers, because sometimes they work on the night shift. Why do you think that is? That is because right up there in the heads of management and in the heads of women too is the idea that our place is really at home. Our place is properly at home. What we are doing is peripheral to what we really ought to be doing. This is one of the things that women's books have got to get written about. We can sit up here and we can complain, and I think we have every right to complain about the way our books get reviewed and our books get treated, but let's get over that. Let's get past that. Let's get to the point that we have things to say, and we are important because we have things to say, and that's one of them.
I just wanted to say that I don't mean to be, some kind of, I don't mean to be getting into new criticism when I say that no personal detail should be said about an author in a review. It's just that there's a line that seems to be crossed between the personal detail that might really make people understand something about the book and just gratuitous information, and I see a lot of that, that's all.
Plus the fact that they get so hung up on these personal details that they never get around to telling you what we're writing about or what our true subject is.
Yes.
Talk.
I think it might be time to open the floor to the audience. There will be people in the audience with microphones who will recognize you if you will raise your hand. And if you would like, would you address your question to a specific member of the panel tonight?
We'll all speak at once.
We'll all speak at once.
Oh, come on, you can't all agree with everything.
There's somebody there. Oh.
To Carolyn,
Yeah.
I would like to know if, for woman novelists, who would be the first critics to criticize their book for when it's being published, when it's first being published, or who would be their first critics? Or who would?
Among women novelists,
But among women novelists,
who would be the first critics? I mean, who would?
who would criticize them first? Would it be a male or?
Well, the book would be assigned for review by the editor of whichever publication was reviewing it, and there are very few women among those editors, I may say. So, whether it went to the Washington Post, to the New York Review, to the, it would go out to all the newspapers. It would go to magazines which do publish reviews. Some of the television stations do book reviews. And who was to review the book would be decided by the editor in charge of the review section.
Well, let me just say, in connection with that question, I find myself feeling very ambivalent about this. I haven't got this licked yet. When I'm asked to review a series of books by women, I suddenly feel, we're being ghettoized again. They're going to stick us on the back pages and let us talk to each other while they don't pay any attention. On the other hand, when I read reviews by women novelists and poets whom I respect and revere, by men who don't seem to understand what they're talking about. Or when I read Clive Barnes' review of Gertrude Stein's The Mother of Us All, I think, by God, why aren't there any women writing theatrical criticism in New York City, other than Edith Oliver, who gets, the leavings of Brendan Gill. So, as I say, I'm very ambivalent about this. I think if I felt there were more men critics who really cared to acknowledge the feminine in themselves, like, let's say, take D.H. Lawrence as a model of a man who was able to do this, then I wouldn't be in this quandary. But as it is, I neither like seeing books by women reviewed exclusively by women, nor do I like seeing books by women misunderstood and downgraded by men.
Have you ever seen a book by a woman misunderstood and downgraded by a woman?
Yeah.
And I've seen books by women well reviewed by men too.
Yeah.
I think perhaps the most useful thing is an appreciative audience, which is aware of what a good book is and what a good review is. This really isn't just a duet between readers and reviewers. You out there, if you would write letters, you can say whether, anything. Say whatever you think, but I do think that a response from beyond the literary colony, so to speak, is a very useful thing.
Yes.
This lady is asking me why, if I can give any light on the question of why older women, and particularly successful women, are hostile to the women's liberation movement. Yes, I can. And first of all, I'll say that an extended discussion of this will be in Ms. in March. And so, just to put it briefly, I think that it has to be realized that that too many older women, the liberation movement seems threatening in a number of ways, and I think one that is particularly distressing is that an awful lot of women have invested a great deal of time, a number of years, a great deal of self-esteem in fulfilling to the best of their ability what they had been brought up to believe was their traditional role. Now, to me, it doesn't seem to be a role which is sufficiently satisfying, a role which allows one easily to be a full human being anymore. That's not saying that it might not have done at some time in the past. In my opinion, it has been narrowed down until there's very little left inside this old happy wife, mother, housewife sort of bit. But a lot of women have died trying, you might say. And when the liberation movement comes along and says this isn't enough, they naturally react by seeing it as a personal criticism of them. This is where their self-esteem is tied up and locked up. All right, housewife. You asked also about the professional woman. Well, the professional woman has often, I think, entered her profession by accepting, in a way, the same definition of what woman's role really ought to be, and then going the other way. But carries into her success in the business world of the profession, shall we say, a sort of feeling of guilt, or perhaps of also, well, you could have done that too. You aren't a happy wife and mother. You were not, if you really had been good at this, you'd have been fulfilled at the age of 25 or something like that. And a lot of her self-esteem, and I think we've just got to keep that self-esteem in mind, is tied up with her specialness, with the fact that she broke away and she made it. Now, to her, the women's movement is saying, we don't want you to be special. We want everybody to be able to do this. you see. So they're threatening her self-esteem by threatening to take away this quality which gives it to her.
Well, could I add something there? On the last point, also, it seems to me that there are a lot of now elderly or aging career women who have made it by being mock men, by adopting the aggressive habits, the mannerisms, the corruptions of capitalism and power and all the ugly things that the women's movement tries to get rid of. And all of a sudden, a woman wakes up at 60 or 70 or whatever and says, well, you know, I've been an imitation man all my life, and now these bloody women want to be women. You know, and then naturally they feel sold. Naturally they feel upset. Who wouldn't have been acting a part all their lives, and a very ugly part, too?
I just would ask, I'm not sure that the premise is as right, you know, is as accurate as everyone else does. It's sort of Pollyannish, but I always assumed that this was true, that older women, professional women, are very resistant to the movement, and housewives and so on. And in the last couple of months, I've done a little bit of speaking, and I have also seen some speeches given. One, for example, last week, Midge Decter spoke before the Women's National Book Association, and there were about 100 women there, many of them in their 50s and 60s, and they gave her as bad a time as the young women did. Also, I mean, a couple of weeks ago, I was speaking at the Woodmere Jewish Center, right? And the older women understood exactly what you were saying. I was surprised that I didn't get people standing up saying, but don't you think women really belong in the home? They understood exactly what the movement was about, and I have a feeling that it's possible that that assumption is a little bit out of date at this point. Anyway, I'm not sure. I just wonder whether it's as true as we think.
Well, I think there's marvelous things have been happening. Not only the number of women who've been turned around, but the number of men. It's just extraordinary. When Erica Young first published a poem called 17 Warnings in Search of a Feminist Poem, I had it up on a bulletin board in my kitchen, and as all the men friends that I have spent a lot of time in my kitchen, this caught their eyes, and they all freaked out in a variety of ways. I'm going to read you the poem. I read it at the Midwest Modern Language Association a couple of weeks ago. And the men led the cheers and applause. They laughed, and I'd begun by saying there's something in here for everyone, And this is the poem. Beware of the man who denounces ambition. His fingers itch under his gloves. Beware of the man who denounces war through clenched teeth. Beware of the man who denounces women writers. His penis is tiny and cannot spell. Beware of the man who wants to protect you. He will protect you from everything but himself. Beware of the man who loves to cook. He will fill your kitchen with greasy pots. Beware of the man who loves your soul. He is a bullshitter. Beware of the man who denounces his mother. He is a son of a bitch. Beware of the man who spells son of a bitch as one word. He is a hack. Beware of the man who loves death too well. He is taking out insurance. Beware of the man who loves life too well. He is a fool. Beware of the man who denounces psychiatrists. He is afraid. Beware of the man who trusts psychiatrists. He is in hock. Beware of the man who picks your dresses. He will want to wear them. Beware of the man you think is harmless. He will surprise you. Beware of the man who cares for nothing but books. He will run like a trickle of ink. Beware of the man who writes flowery love letters. He is preparing you for years of silence. Beware of the man who praises liberated women. He is planning to quit his job. Now you see all those men out there applauding.
More questions from the audience? Something here?
I'd like to ask all four of you, in regard to the editors that you've worked with on the various books, whether they're male or female, and how you feel that their sex influences the project that you're currently working on.
I'm sorry, I couldn't get that. I don't know if other people could.
How our sex influences the projects we're currently working on.
Whether a male or female editor makes a difference to a project that you're working on or influences you. Have all four of you worked mostly with women editors?
Well, since I don't work with editors, I can't speak to that.
And I don't see how one can generalize about editors because they're human beings, and some of them are nice and some of them aren't.
Yes, I think that so. I think it has much more to do with the individual. I don't mind being edited at all about any magazine articles because I know that has to be for a special audience. I'm a bitch kitty about being edited on books because that's really what where I lay my life down in the line. Now, if an editor will tell me that he or she doesn't understand it, if I'm mixed up or something like that, I'll go off, if they don't get the point, I'll go off and rework it myself, male or female. But I'm giving you this just as an example of the fact that it does depend first on what you're writing, the kind of thing that you're writing, whether you know you're writing for a specific audience, where help from an editor can be very useful indeed, or whether you really are writing something which you feel much more you must control, and they're really all I want, personally at any rate, is simply somebody to tell me whether I've made my point or not. And there, it couldn't matter less, as long as I, think they're intelligent.
Another question?
I just want to say that I have, my editor left the publishing house that I was at, and I asked for a woman editor. Partly because the book I want to write is very personal, and it seemed to me I was going to get more feedback from someone. Also, I wanted someone who was approximately my generation, so that if I wrote about something that had happened to me, this is just a very sort of simple thing, she might say, "Oh, and do you remember thus and such?" And I might have forgotten it. Other than that, but that's an important thing. So.
Well, what about working for a magazine like Esquire? Do you care not to comment on that?
No, I have a man editor at Esquire, and I'm crazy about him. He's a fabulous editor. So,
My editors have all been women, and my current editor is an angel. And if she's out there, I blow her a kiss.
Another question?
Thank you. You mentioned the name of Erica Young, and you read some of her poetry, and you've also, Ms. Kaiser, mentioned the name of some of the poets that you think are speaking particularly to what's on women's minds today. But I wonder if I might ask Ms. Janeway if she would do a similar service about women novelists. The only name really mentioned tonight has been Joan Didion, and she's been kind of set aside. And Violet Weingarten, who was just mentioned very briefly and with praise. But I am interested, for instance, in anything about Joyce Carol Oates or any other writer that you think we should be very much aware of.
Well, certainly Joyce Carol Oates, I think, is one of our great writers. And I am ready to get down and shine her shoes anytime she comes along and asks me to. I think there are many other excellent women novelists, playwrights. I just don't have a list in my head.
Margaret Drabble. If you're a woman, and if you have a daughter over the age of 16, get a book in paperback called The Waterfall. It's changed my life, and it will change the lives constructively of every female who reads it. Now, which is not to say that men shouldn't read it either, but it is a magnificent book. The Waterfall by Margaret Drabble. Drabble. She published a fine novel last year called The Needle's Eye. And she seems to be a very little-known English novelist, and she is simply magnificent.
Well, she's better known in England than she is here.
Right.
She's published about novels, I would say, and I think, I don't know whether they're in print here or not,
Yeah,
but they're certainly in libraries. And
No,
they may
the
be
waterfall I
in-
bought in Kennedy Airport, so it's in print. But the great thing about it is she writes about things that you thought were special only to you, only your own hang-ups, your own neurotic oblomovisms, your own inability to get done with the housework and get on with your work and all that. I mean, and also the idea that most women have at some period in their lives, usually in their late teens, is that other women have achieved the big O and only they are frigid, etc. This is just, it's a masterpiece of a book. It moved me to tears many times over. I just buy every copy I see and push it on people.
We
I think
certainly want to read Muriel Spark. We want to read Penelope Gilliot.
Doris Lessing, of course.
Oh, Doris Lessing, yes, good God. Nadine Gordimer.
Right.
It's just you draw a blank when you're just sitting.
Carol Berger, Among the Young.
Okay.
New novel out this week. Another commercial.
To say nothing of Simone de Beauvoir's novels, which are not to be.
I think I want to direct this question to Nora Efron. Do you think that anything's changed in women's magazines besides Ms.?
Aside from MS? Is that what you said?
Yes, besides that one.
Do you ever read them?
Well, I think, yes, I'm afraid I do. I watch television too, okay?
Sure. I read the front page.
No, I think that there are, I hate to say there's been change because I hate to give too much credit. Obviously Good Housekeeping looks pretty much the same as it ever did, but Red Book is really quite different if you look at it. Every so often there's something quite radical in it. They were one of the first to print articles about abortion in daycare centers that were very, very sympathetic. I don't know that overcompensates for those masses of hamburger recipes, but it's something. It's hard to tell. I'm very suspicious of it. I was part of the demonstration at the Ladies' Home Journal and the whole action there the women's action there, and it was a great shock to me to find that the next year John Mack Carter, the editor of it, was a feminist. I thought he had really come too late, and now they have columns in it called Working Woman and so on, but I just cannot get over my suspicion that it's only there because they think people want to read about it, not because it's in their hearts. On the other hand, it's there to be read. One of the really unfortunate things about the women's magazines is that as all the magazines fold, there's less and less a market for fiction, and particularly women who write fiction that is at all angry have a lot of trouble finding a market for it. It is true that you can sell fiction about many of the things women care about to the women's magazines, but only within certain parameters, I think. And until some of the men's magazines open up a little bit more to it, it's a serious problem. I feel that I've really rambled here, but
the typical rejection slip that one gets from men's magazines often says that they can't use the word because it's too feminine. I don't know what that means, really.
Yeah, well, of course, everyone knows this, but Playboy would only print articles by women if you used your initial until a couple of years ago. Well, now they're very proud. They printed a story by Joyce Carol Oates, big deal.
JC,
That's
huh?
one. They're still very, very, very closed off to the things that women care about. And Esquire's a little bit better, but not much,
Someone here, I think.
Could you give us any insights into the New York Times book section, particularly the edition that carried the Joan Didion article on the front and had a very hateful editorial on the inside back page about woman's place being in the home, both in the same issue?
No, it wasn't schizophrenia.
Well, that's journalism. You have different points of view being expressed in the same place. I don't think that you can control.
No, it wasn't different.
I mean, is this?
It wasn't so different.
No, I don't think the Didion article was too long.
I was, I found the Didion article very upsetting. She has a right to write it, and it's absolutely sort of classic Didion. It's not a surprise to anyone, except for all those critics who thought she was a feminist on the last book. I just was kind of, I've talked about it at such length with my friends that I don't know how much you want to hear about it. I noted John Leonard had a thing in that issue or in the one afterward talking about her brilliant essay on the women's movement, and it was just an essay to make you wring her throat, not yours. One of the things she said in it, the main point of it really, in case anyone missed it, and I hope I'm not doing it too much of an injustice, was that the women's movement was really quite interesting and noble when it started out thinking of itself as a class and having all these political ideals, but now it's gone and become personal, and it's just too grubby for words. And it was an interesting article because a friend of mine pointed out that it was an interesting example of ontology recapitulating phylogeny because she started out very political and sort of degenerated into a whole personal thing about how women really believe in blood and birth and death, and this is the special essence of being a woman. Mm-hmm. And, one of the...
Yukio Mishima, yeah.
Well, one of the things that I think is interesting about the women's movement is its persistent attempt to bring the political and personal together, which I think is really marvelous, and to not understand that, to say, oh, well, marriage contracts, that's so trivial, is really to miss the point, I believe. So.
Another question?
Yes, I have a question. It seems to me from what you've said that the general level of incomprehension shown toward women is not much more significant than the general level of incomprehension shown, especially by magazines, toward all subjects, whether it's ecology, contemporary music, politics. And I was just wondering whether you had any reflections on that.
The general level of
incomprehension, that is, toward women writing and toward the writing of women is not significantly higher or more pronounced than the general level of incomprehension toward a lot of significant other things. And I was
I'm not an ecologist.
No, but I think the gentleman has a point here, which is that men who fail to release or acknowledge the feminine within themselves, and I'm not now talking about necessarily biology, but I'm talking about heads, principally, can't really talk sensibly about ecology or anything else, because they don't really have enough stake in what life's all about. In other words, if a woman doesn't know some of the time what it feels like to be a man, if a man doesn't know some of the time what it feels like to be a woman, I don't see how they can make sense about anything.
I'd like to hear from Helen Vendler a little about being a woman literary critic.
Oh, I haven't been writing about women ever, so that it's no subject of expertise of mine. I write about men, as it turns out. I've written about Yeats, I've written about Stevens, I've written about Herbert, and if I go on, it will be about Walt Whitman. So that I feel as though the minds that I've wanted to write about, or the poets that I've wanted to write about, have happened not to be women. When I ask myself why that is, now that our consciousnesses are being raised, I have asked myself why it is. The woman poet that would appear plausible would be Emily Dickinson. I think she's the only woman poet equal in stature to the men poets I've been writing about. And I don't know why she hasn't attracted me any more than I don't know why I don't want to write on Spencer or why I don't want to write on Donne. But it has nothing to do with her being a woman. It has to do with her being a poet that doesn't somehow speak to me in the same way that the poets I know best do. I've thought about this in respect to reviewing books of poetry. It hasn't come my way very often to review poetry by women because most of the poetry that comes my way, even in an unselected way, most of the general poetry that's being written in America is being written by men, so far as I can tell. I see a lot of books printed on hand presses, printed in cellars, printed in backyards, accompanied by touching letters. We are living without any conveniences. We pail water out of an ice hole and so on. I see poetry coming from quite far below the level of whatever, Viking Press or Simon & Schuster. So I don't think that I'm just seeing the poetry that makes it through male editors or something of that sort. I see a lot of grassroots poetry, but most of it is written by men, even in small presses, even backwoods. Why that is still a question in my mind. The best poetry in America is being written equally, I think, by men and women. There have been notable women poets, some of them mentioned this evening. I don't feel any different reviewing their poetry from the way I feel reviewing a man's poetry. It seems to me that the form transcends gender, and always has. I was perplexed when a book came through for review that someone named Anne Stanford has put together out on the West Coast called Poetry in English by Women. I read it through to see if it made any sense. It doesn't make any sense at all. There is no visible unity in English poetry written by women that would make the same sense that, say, an anthology of religious poetry makes. I don't see that there is such a thing as poetry by women. There's only poetry.
I think my question is perhaps badly timed after that last discussion. I was intending to ask whether the kind of consciousness that was discussed earlier, that of the oppressed viewing the oppressor, had any impact on new form that might be emerging, whether in fiction, nonfiction, or poetry.
I'm sorry.
Oppressed consciousness makes for new form.
To some degree, yes, I think it does, because form is made by new material. Always. Some of this out of women. I'm losing my mind now, but some of the French women novelists and several. Some others come in this way, as do on the black side, certainly some of the African writers coming from a completely different background of experience and bringing things in and pulling them apart. Yes, I think certainly as far as the novel goes, but this will not be things that are thought of now as being women's novels, I don't think.
Nadine Gordimer, certainly, when she's writing a great political novel about Africa with a kind of grasp of the subtleties of politics of emerging nations and so forth, or many of the great contemporary women historians are writing, or the marvelous Vietnam book by Frankie Fitzgerald. I mean, these are the kinds of books that people think of as being capable of being written only by men, or have thought so until quite recently. But I tend to agree with, was it Eliot who, if anyone in the audience knows, please tell, who said that, or maybe it was Yeats, who said that people tend to use new material, working through traditional forms, and those who use innovative forms tend to depend on traditional material, and I still think there's a lot of truth in that.
Well, I think you've got enough new material, and it breaks the form in spite of yourself. I really do. And
I'm
I
not
think there's,
sure.
well, all right, this is obviously grounds for a long
I think we have time for one more question.
This has to go back to reviewing in a sense, but it has also to do with people's attitudes towards women writers, which is that Mary Ellman, in her fine book, Thinking About Women, noted that people writing about women would always talk about women as shrill or not shrill, talk about them in terms of the typical womanly qualities. And I'm not going to defend Anatole Broyard, but in that review of Shelley Starman List's book, which he titled Woman as Groaning Board, which really offended me when I read it. Groaning Board, cornucopia of sexual delights. He was taking the absolutely polar opposite view of interpreting or responding to women's writings, which was, he was assuming that women wanted to be seen as something other than shrill, as a great variety of things. He was doing it, I think, in a mocking way, but do you think there's any middle ground? Do you think that he was taking his lead from a media interpretation?
Who is the name of the...
I'm sorry, that microphone has so much bounce up here that it's very hard to hear. If you could just sort of stand up and say it without the microphone, it would be perfect.
I'm saying that there are two extremes in reacting to women's writing. And it seems to me that Anatole Broyard has now gone to the extreme. He believes women want him to take, yet he does it in a mocking manner, as women as grown. Is there a middle ground? Or does this just have to blow over to a movement of being as writers and not as one extreme or another? Not as a three-named woman writer like Frances talking to the team, and not as an angry sort of.
I would like to say, could I say one thing about this? I was a little disturbed by your characterization of Joan Didion as Akasha Suf, because you could just as well say that about Rilke, or as far as that goes, George Herbert. I mean, most writers have spent their time saying how much I'm suffering, and I mean, that seems to me a perfectly legitimate and, not to say noble, theme for writing. And
yes, but there is a difference between the open expression of pain and the open plea for pity. Self-pity contaminated by a kind of sentimentality, which was characteristic of many women writers in the 20s and some men writers as well, is very, very different from the open agony of the great writer. And that goes for Dickinson as well as for Herbert.
And also, I think there's an enormous amount of joy in Herbert.
well, all that says is that good writers express self-pity well, and bad writers express self-pity badly.
Self-pity is
I think of self-pity as a very legitimate literary emotion.
oh, gee, I don't. I don't either.
Shakespeare's sonnets are full of self-pity.
Oh, I don't think so.
No.
They're very objective. He
There's
takes
Shakespearean in the
himself.
house?
He takes himself as subject, but he separates himself as writer from himself as material being written about.
I
really
couldn't
think he
disagree
does.
with you more.
Oh, dear.
I'd like to say that my name is Rosa Gretchen, and I'm a woman novelist that nobody mentioned.
I overdid. I beg your pardon. I think.
Mea maxima culpa.
Read Rosalind Braxton.
I think since it's 10:15, we must bring this to a close. I want to thank Elizabeth Janeway, Carolyn Kaiser, and Nora Efron for coming tonight, and to thank you all for being such a responsive audience.
Now we're ready to go backstage and fight.
Thanks for listening. 92nd Street Y Unterberg Poetry Center webcasts and access to our archive are made possible by the generous support of the Sidney E. Frank Foundation. For more information on 92nd Street Y and all of our programs, please visit us on the web at 92y.org. This program is copyright 1972 by 92nd Street Y.